Hello there! Today I am here to talk to you about the audiobooks that I listened to in November. Strangely, it's feeling like it's been a really long time since I listened to some of these. One of them in particular I technically listened to in October, but I finished it at the very start of November, so that is not fresh in my mind, but we're going to try this anyway. So I listened to 4 things this month, the first of which was Disobedience by Naomi Alderman. This was narrated by Rachel Atkins. Now Naomi Alderman, I'm sure a lot of you know, is the woman who wrote The Power, which got a lot of hype a few years ago. And I have to say that I listened to The Power on audiobook as well. And I really enjoyed the listening experience of it. I really enjoyed the narration personally. It was one of my sort of most memorable books of the year, but I definitely have heard some things since then that have kind of made me think that I probably wouldn't enjoy it if I read it. It's a good concept, but there are issues with the narrative and certainly the timeline. But anyway, I wanted to pick up Disobedience because I knew it focused around the idea of a lesbian relationship. It was a really interesting listen actually. This is basically, it follows a woman who, obviously I can't remember her name, I listened to this like a month ago. It follows a woman who grew up in an Orthodox Jew household and community, and she has since kind of stopped practicing her Judaism and has moved to, I think, New York, and her father then dies, so she has to return to her hometown and obviously face up to all the people that she's left behind. She left in some controversy when she was involved in a relationship with another woman, and it basically, I wouldn't say that this is a book about the lesbian relationship in itself. What I actually liked about this story was that the lesbian couple, it wasn't the central focus of the book. It was much more about the character and facing up to why she has such big issues with the community that she grew up in and how that has shaped her life and etc. It's not, the relationship's there and it's obviously a formative part of her life and it does sort of drive the narrative, but it's not the main thing, and a lot of people in the reviews that I read said that as a negative thing and that they felt like the same-sex couple was in there just for, you know, to hype things up and make people pick the book up, or to sort of jump on a diversity bandwagon as it were. But actually I don't find that that was the case with this book. I think what was refreshing about it was that the lesbian couple wasn't a main thing, and it wasn't just in there for a gimmick. It wasn't like it didn't need to be in there because it was a formative part of the narrative in itself, but it wasn't made a big deal of, and I think that's really refreshing because there are so many books that, yes, while they're trying to address issues of a lack of diversity, they kind of go over the top with it, or, you know, if there is a lesbian couple, they're always like, everything in the book is about the lesbian couple. So it was refreshing to just have a lesbian relationship that was just there, but it wasn't a big deal, it wasn't a thing, it wasn't really dissected, it was just normal, which I found quite refreshing. I have to say the overall ending of this book is a little bit lacking, and I can understand there were a lot of negative reviews regarding the ending, because it kind of, though it's realistic, and I think that's probably what Naomi Alderman was going for, it does kind of, I suppose, take it back to the patriarchy in a way. It looks at, I suppose, a certain woman's sexuality being squashed, and that isn't resolved. She doesn't break free from that in the end, which is problematic, but as I say, I think Naomi Alderman was kind of doing that because that is realistic. A lot of women have to put up with a life that they would rather not have, sadly, especially in Orthodox communities. I personally say that I really enjoyed this. I think it was a more realised novel actually than The Power, which is interesting because I think this one came before The Power, although it's been sort of re-released obviously in light of The Power's success. I think the main thing that came across in this for me was the fact that it looks very much at the Jewish communities, and not only how same-sex relationships are treated, but how actually women are still very much classed as second-class citizens, which is something that I think is rife in so many religions, and yet it's not really spoken about. I mean, Mormonism, for instance, where men are allowed to have as many wives as they want, and even Christianity to some extent, the woman is kind of subservient to the man. The Jewish community, some of the things that were read out from some of the things that were read out from the religious teachings in the community were really quite shocking in terms of how sort of a woman had to bask in a man's glory effectively. And I think that's really interesting, and it brought up a lot of things that I didn't previously know about. That was a really good and important thing, I think. I would recommend this. I would recommend listening to it. I don't, as I say, I can't recommend the book because I didn't read it, but definitely found enough in this to see me through, and I enjoyed it. I would say there is a film which I don't know if it's out or if it's coming out, which involves Rachel McAdams and another woman playing the women in this relationship. And a lot of the reviews that I saw of this book looked at it in light of the film, or a lot of them seemed to literally just be talking about the film, and I can understand all the issues with that film because I'm not being funny, but Rachel McAdams and this other woman who I can't remember her name, she is a famous actress, neither of whom are lesbians, let's just put that out there, both of whom are very attractive, well-known actresses. It's, you know, I mean, it's problematic, but I wouldn't judge the book on that because I don't think that's fair, so I would recommend listening to this if you get a chance. Then, speaking of Rachel McAdams, I listened to Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery, narrated by Rachel McAdams. I really like Rachel McAdams. I think she's a very sweet and gently spoken woman, so she was perfect for this, and I think her narration was wonderful. She very much captured the voices, and you could tell that this is a book that meant something to her, which was really lovely because you really got that feeling that she was excited and passionate about narrating it, which was nice. I have shamefully never read Anne of Green Gables. It's just not a book that I came across when I was younger. So I snapped it up when I saw it on Daily Deals, and I decided to get to it this month, and I'm really glad that I did actually. I think it's just a lovely, sweet book. For those of you who don't know, which I don't imagine as many of you, Anne of Green Gables is about a little orphan called Anne who ends up going to stay with a family called the Cuthberts, who have been very precise about the fact that they want a boy because they want somebody to help on their farm. Anne gets sent to them by mistake, but she is such a charming little girl that they decide to keep her, and this is basically about the journeys and the life that she leads with them. And obviously Anne is the main focus of this story. I think this is of the time, and there are a few kids' books like it, where girls are kind of portrayed as very sensible and sort of above their years and really wiser than the adults around them. You've got the same kind of thing in books like The Secret Garden, The Little Princess, really just smart and sensible girls. And Anne is definitely one of them. She uses big words, she reads all these books, she sort of teaches the adults a thing or two. I would say that really her character is entirely unrealistic for a little girl, but it's still quite sweet. One thing I would say is that the book looks at from when she meets the Cuthberts and when she comes to stay with them, I think when she's 12, and then it follows her right through to when she's sort of leaving them for college. And I did find that what was really sweet and lovely about the beginning section when she's younger is that she was obviously very naive and innocent, but she thought she was so clever, and there was just a real comfort about it, and it was really sweet. And I did feel like it kind of got lost a little bit when she went to college and sort of grew up, as it were, which I suppose is inevitable. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed this, and as I say, I could not get enough of Rachel McAdams' narration. I think the way that she told this story and just the pacing and the gentleness of her voice has to be probably my favourite narration that I've listened to on an audiobook. It was just wonderful to listen to. Then, as a nod to non-fiction November, I listened to Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton, and this was narrated by Dolly Alderton. I wasn't particularly bothered by this book when it came out, but I have seen so many people talk about it that it kind of inadvertently came onto my radar. I was then listening to a podcast with Dolly Alderton, and I found it quite interesting and I liked what she was saying, so I thought I would pick this one up. I have to say I don't quite get the hype, but I don't think I'm the sort of sole audience for this book. So this is what it sounds like. It is Dolly Alderton telling us everything that she knows about love. It's basically a memoir looking at her various exploits into the world of romance and effectively looking at what she learned from each of them, the mistakes that she made in each of them, to eventually coming to the lessons that she knows now that she's 29 going on 30. I would say that I'm not the prime audience for this, but then I don't really know what the prime audience for this is, and I think that's where my main issue with it came in, because Dolly Alderton is obviously looking at relationship mistakes that you make when you're a teenager or in your early 20s. So obviously I'm past that and I've made pretty much the same mistakes a lot of the time. And you know, I'm kind of coming out the end and I'm in a happy and settled relationship now. So on the surface of things, I was thinking that this book was probably aimed for much younger girls. But then at the same time, it talks about quite adult and mature relationships, especially sexually. So I don't think it's necessarily suitable for teens. I think it's actually got quite a narrow audience in that I think it probably suits people from 20 to 25-ish. But yeah, so it kind of, I felt, alienated me a little bit in that sense because I don't feel like I learned anything from this book. I would also say that Dolly Alderton, she comes at things from a very privileged standpoint. So she grew up in a sort of nice suburb in London. She's very upper middle class, went to quite a posh school, and she's obviously got all these white, affluent Londoner friends, which, you know, to some extent that's just her life. She can't help that. But I did feel like it kind of felt like being preached at by somebody who's in a much better position, if you know what I mean. And there are a few times where she sort of says about feeling like the sort of pauper at a party because she only earns 30 grand a year, and it's like, yeah, but... So there were, that was an issue for me, and I think some of the things that she describes, such as taking a taxi halfway across the country on a whim when she was in university and it costing her a couple of £100, and things like that, I think she has had a very privileged life in that sense, which, you know, as I say, it is what it is, but I think that kind of put me at a distance from this as well. Ultimately, I did enjoy it. It was a pleasant listening experience, and I'm glad that Dolly Alderton narrated it herself. Would I rave about how amazing this memoir is? Probably not. As I say, I don't feel like it particularly taught me anything. I don't particularly understand the audience that this is aimed at. But I think if you're in your early 20s and are having trouble working out the relationship thing and trying to make things work for yourself, then perhaps this is for you. And then I finished on The Outcasts of Time. This is by Ian Mortimer, and it was narrated by Barnaby Edwards. This was a complete whim buy for me. It was on the Daily Deals. I had not heard of it, which I don't usually gravitate towards Daily Deal books that I haven't heard of. I will only sort of buy books that I've heard of or know something about. But this, the premise kind of intrigued me, and it sounded like it would be quite a lot of fun. And the reason that I listened to it this month is because if you've been following my other videos, you'll know that I'm doing a little thing called Not the Normal November, where I'm reading books that I wouldn't typically, which I haven't really done with my audiobooks, but I thought I would do with this one because it is a historical fiction, which I don't often read. This is effectively a story about two brothers who are alive during the plague, and one of them, I think he's called William, but I might be wrong, one of them tries to do a good deed, but it ends up backfiring in quite a major way, quite a gruesome way actually. I was a bit surprised. And effectively a voice comes to him and tells him that he can either go back to his family. He's now got the plague. He can either go back to his family, live out his last 6 days of life and sort of say goodbye to everybody, or he can go 99 years into the future and effectively see what no man has seen before. And it's kind of, it's not the most original idea. It was kind of the idea of he had to go into the future and make up for his bad deeds. So obviously that's not a new idea, it's something that's been discussed in films and literature for a long time. But I really enjoyed this. I think it was so much fun, and actually it was really nicely written. Particularly William, let's call him William, I think he's called William, ends up travelling to a few different time periods. This effectively ends up being about people and the way that people ultimately never change even when the world around them changes, the way that every age has its issues. It was just generally a really fun listen. It's quite fascinating because William would come across things like a mirror, which obviously he hadn't had, or, you know, predictably he goes to see a film in one of them and he can't understand whether what he's seeing is actually there or not. When he finds a toilet, a proper toilet for the first time, that's quite interesting. But it's not a comical book. It's quite serious, and it, as I say, it generally looks at the human condition and also ultimately the difference between good and bad, and effectively the grey area between them and how William has been misinterpreting that grey area and taking things too literally. As I say, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm so glad that I took a punt on it. One thing I would say is that it's about 12 hours, the audiobook, and I think the book is about 400 pages long, which I have to say is probably a bit too long. He ends up travelling to possibly 1 or 2 time zones too many, especially I think the last time zone we probably could have done without, and the book wouldn't necessarily have lost anything. The last 2 hours of listening to it, I was kind of a bit, oh come on now, let's get to the end, because I'd been listening to it for 10 hours by then. But ultimately I would really recommend this, and as I say, it's exciting to find a book that I just picked up on a whim for the first time in so long, and to have really enjoyed it, so that was pleasant. Let me know down below if you've been listening to any audiobooks this month, and I will see you next time. Bye!